a narrow role, and the DOJ provided the court with information from multiple sources about Page's activities with Russians.
And Carter Page, I don't know if anyone who takes him seriously as a Russian agent, including the Russians or the FBI, because he had worked with the FBI against the Russians back in 2013, and he never played any real role in the Trump campaign.
Also pushed back against charges that the FBI misled the court about Steele's motivations and financial backing from the DNC, writing that the court was informed were politically motivated and wanted to discredit Trump's campaign.
We wanted it out. We want it out because we think it is clear evidence that the Democrats are not only trying to cover this up, but they're also colluding with parts of the government to help cover this up. But what you're not going to see is anything that actually rejects what was in our memo.
The Schiff memo also suggests that in addition to the investigation into Carter Page, the FBI opened several sub-inquiries into multiple Trump campaign associates by September of 2016.
All right, let's talk about what we've discovered in this Democratic rebuttal. Joining us now, CNN reporter Kara Scannell, National Security Attorney Mark Zaid, and CNN political analyst Julian Zeller. So good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Kara, let me start with you. The president says it's a confirmation of the Republican memo. You heard there from Chairman Nunes, no actual rejections of his memo. Is he right?
Well, I think that, depending on which side you want to believe, you can read it either way. But the Democratic memo does knock down some of the notions that the Republican memo put forward, which you just heard Christie report, the notion that it was politically motivated and that wasn't disclosed. It was disclosed in the application to the court, according to the Democrats, that this was the source of this information was looking to discredit the Trump campaign. The other notion that the memo was based, that the FISA warrant was based entirely on the dossier was also knocked down because we know that the FBI had interviewed Carter Page in March of 2016. That's several months before they sought this application in October of 2016.
Yeah. And
it was the same month that Carter Page joined the Trump campaign.
Mark, let's go through that point specifically of disclosure of political elements here. The GOP memo claimed, and let's put it up on the screen, that neither the initial application in October 2016 nor any of the renewals disclose or reference the role of the DNC Clinton campaign or any party campaign in funding Steele's efforts. This from the Democratic rebuttal. The FBI speculates that the identified U.S. person was likely looking for information that could be used to discredit candidate one's campaign. Actually, they say that that was in the application for the warrant. So this goes to the central narrative of what the Republicans claimed.
No, absolutely. And in fact, the one thing really that is so new in this memo is that we have language from the FISA application actually quoted, because quite frankly, there's not much in this 10-page document that's new. Between leaks and legitimate appearances by House members of the House Select Committee on Intelligence after the Nunes memo came out, all of this really had been said, and we've been talking about it for almost the last month. But that point was really important. Okay, it doesn't say that Clinton campaign, but it says that this memo had some motivations to discredit the Trump campaign. And it doesn't really make a difference from a bias standpoint, whether that was GOP objections to the Trump campaign, of which there was numerous. And, let's not forget the original folks that were hiring Steele to do his work and the organization that hired him were actually from anti-Trump GOP members.
Hey, Julian, let's also put this into the context. The president tweeted out last night that the memo shows that there was no, and let's put this up, where the memo did not name Hillary Clinton, the memo did not name the DNC, but this comes after a year of Republicans' outrage about unmasking in this process.
Right, so there's a hypocritical claim by the Republicans about why the specific names weren't mentioned, but it's pretty clear from the language that the fact that this came from a political operation was, it was stated. And it didn't matter because there was so much other evidence that the courts and the investigators were looking at, this was one piece of the puzzle. So if you look at this memo and you agree with the memo, it means that the Republicans on this committee skewed the information, misled the public, and their memo, they were really trying to slant all the evidence to make a case that would discredit this.
Kara, the House Intelligence Committee is still investigating Russia and potential involvement in with the Trump campaign, meddling in the election. What does this process, now that it's devolved into these dueling memos and rebuttals, what does it mean for the confidence in that finding? Can they even reach a consensus?
Well, both parties in this committee have been really disjointed for much of this investigation. So you've got the Democrats wanting to pursue various threads, including seeking financial records and going down into the weeds on that, and the Republicans will not grant them subpoena power to do that. So they're a fractured group, and I think as it continues, it's not going to get any better. We're going to still see both sides try to move forward with their investigation. The Republicans are in control, so they'll determine what interviews go forward in the future. But I do think we're going to see two different reports at the end of the day, one from the majority and one from the minority.
Julian, the president said that the Nunes memo, as it relates to Bob Mueller's Russia investigation, special counsel, several congressional Republicans came out and said this has nothing to do with that. The Nunes memo really has nothing to do with that. Does this rebuttal have any impact or any connection at all to that either?
No, I don't think it will, only in that we now live in two worlds, and two parties are seeing the same investigation through a very different lens. It is important and relevant that the Democratic shows that the reasons for the investigation were legitimate. They were not political. That said, it doesn't really matter given how partisan this has become. And I think in the end, the president could have tweeted that tweet before he saw the memo, and many of his supporters would believe it. And that's a problem for a real investigation to happen.
Mark, give us the big picture here. The precedent. We are now reading portions of warrant application through the FISA court. We now have this precedent of the Republicans will release their view, their politically partisan view of something. The Democrats will release their view. What does this mean for the future of this process?
You know, that's a great question. You know, I love reading information about the FISA court. This is a secretive court, the FISC, that we don't get to see. And every time one of these memos comes out and information gets declassified, we use it in numerous lawsuits, particularly under the Freedom of Information Act, to try and get access to greater information. That said, this process has destroyed what was usually a bipartisan effort by the House Select Committee on Oversight of Intelligence to look into executive branch issues for the last 40 years. It has destroyed what was this past use. And right now, and what Julian was saying, the partisanship is at such a high level. The politicization of intelligence is so rampant that I have a great fear for the institutional aspects of this system that's being destroyed, the very fabric being destroyed as we see both sides duel with national security information that, frankly, we're never supposed to see.
Chairman Nunes was on stage at the time when this was released yesterday, and he said that Democrats were trying to cover this up. There was collusion in trying to prevent certain things from being released. Is there any clarity in what he was talking about specifically? And can you speak to what he also claimed was the intentional 2-week delay on the part of Democrats on releasing this, the redacted version?
Well, there was no, hard to understand what he means by obstruction or what they're alleging by the Democrats. The process here was that the White House was given the Democratic memo just as it was given the Republican memo. The White House sent it back saying that there were concerns about not releasing it. And of course, they did not have those concerns on the Republican memo. So over the past 2 weeks, they've been dealing with the FBI, which has opposed the release of either memo, was working to redact certain portions of this Schiff memo in order to not reveal too many details about sources and methods. So that's really why there was this delay. And it was the White House that then went back to the White House, and it was the White House that said now it was ready and fine to be released, and they released it on a Saturday.
All right, Kara Scannell, Mark Zaid, Julian Zelizer, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen, don't miss today's State of the Union with Jake Tapper. He's going to have Representative Adam Schiff with him to discuss the memo. That's at 9 a.m. Eastern this morning on CNN. And ahead, the wall between them. The Mexican president will not be heading to Washington after all, after a confrontational phone call with President Trump.
8 people, and he came in through the system. Well, I don't want that. I want people to come in ultimately. We want people to come in through merit.
That was President Trump on Fox News last night talking about the way forward on immigration and his plans for a border wall, which he still says Mexico will pay for. But according to Mexico's president, they're not budging on this.
Yeah, in fact, Mexico's president, Enrique Peña Nieto, just called off an official trip to Washington to meet with President Trump after another tense phone call last week over that wall.
Let's bring in CNN.
Between President Donald Trump and Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto. Now, Peña Nieto was scheduled to visit Washington tentatively at the beginning of March, but that trip will no longer continue, in part because of that tense phone call on Tuesday. Now, the president, according to a White House official, continued to push for Mexico to finance that border wall. That is something that he's been doing since the early days of the 2016 presidential campaign, and it's something that Peña Nieto has been consistently saying Mexico will not pay for. Now, a White House official said that this phone call was less tense than one in January 2017, where Peña Nieto canceled another trip to Washington, but the phone call led to no resolution about the funding of that wall. We should note that President Trump is trying to get money for the wall any way he can. He's also pushed Congress to fund his wall, and while a bipartisan group of lawmakers presented him with a plan that would give him $25 billion in border security in exchange for citizenship for 1.2 million Dreamers, the president rejected that plan, saying he wanted more changes to the legal immigration system. So clearly the president wants this border wall but doesn't know how to get it, and Peña Nieto is up for re-election in July of 2018. He can't be seen as giving any concessions to the White House.
All right, Lauren Fox in Washington.
February of last year, the Mexican president called off a planned trip to meet with the president over a similar scuttle. If the president cannot convince Mexico to build this wall, is there a political ramification for him?
For President Trump, right now, the main ramification is if he allows amnesty for the estimated 1.2 million undocumented immigrants. That would be the huge concession that really hurts within his base. Building the border wall, that's become sort of a non-factor, and really this game of chicken between Peña Nieto and Trump, for a lot of people, is not as big of a deal. Whether the border wall gets built or not is something that, you know, for Trump supporters, that might be a big thing, but amnesty is a whole lot bigger and completely different issue that I think would hurt the immigration stance of President Trump.
Sure. So Jared Kushner, we understand, the president's son-in-law, he's in charge, as we know, of managing the U.S.-Mexico relationship, among many other things. But officials say that a few hours after both of the presidents spoke on Tuesday, Kushner actually called Peña Nieto, tried to help smooth things over, still canceled the trip. What does that tell you about, and we've been talking a lot about this with the security clearances, about Kushner?
Handling specific sensitive White House issues and the fact that they don't have full security clearances are certainly concerning. With respect to the U.S.-Mexico relationship, now there are definitely some Mexican officials who would say that the relationship between the Trump administration and the Peña Nieto administrations are closer than they were in previous administrations. However, what we're seeing from reports is that, you know, even though the top two leaders are not agreeing on anything, maybe that actual relationship between the administrations are formidably stronger. But again, that only really matters when you get results. And right now, both sides are at a political stalemate, and they're not going to get anything done, at least until Peña Nieto either gets reelected or there's a change in leadership.
Officials say they may try to meet again in Washington or at the Summit of the Americas in Peru. That's happening in April. What's the expectation there?
The expectation is probably more of the same. You know, you're going to have this, you know, chest thumping. Whoever can back down first is really going to be the winner in all of this, because, you know, with President Trump's border wall, that's, you know, anywhere from $12 to $15 billion by conservative estimates, all the way up from $67 billion by Democratic estimates. You know, we're not so sure right now, and President Trump needs to make a convincing argument, at least in the lead up to the midterm elections, that this is still a good idea.
Right, right. Siraj Hashmi, we appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
The students in Parkland are preparing to head back to school this week as the president offers what he believes would be a bipartisan solution to gun reform. But will the NRA support it?
Also, the closing ceremony of the Winter Olympic Games. Underway right now, in fact. South Koreans are protesting the controversial official leading the North Korean delegation. Why? Well, we have a live report for you from Pyeongchang next. Are going to be going back to class in 3 days. The first day on campus is Wednesday, and that's 2 weeks after a gunman killed 14 students and 3 staff members.
Now, before they go back to class, a group of students, including some victims in that attack, marched in Parkland, Florida. They were showing support for both the school and their fight for stricter gun laws in the state.
And after that shooting, the president has signaled he's open to the discussion of stricter background checks for gun purchases.
Last night on Fox News, the president renewed his push for stricter background checks that would include some kind of screening for mental illness.
We would have a section on, a very powerful section on mental illness. And somebody who is mentally ill should not have a weapon, should not have a gun. And that would be covered in the background checks. And I think the NRA is going to be for it. I think that a lot of people, I mean, this certainly should be bipartisan. But
it's a midterm year and the season just makes this unrealistic.
No, I'm sure that Democrats would be absolutely open to making some real changes in gun safety measures that would make a real impact. The problem is that we can't really believe anything that comes out of this president's mouth, both because it can change at any moment. It can change 2 seconds from now after he tweets something different, and also because it's completely hypocritical. Victor, this president says that he wants strong measures against the mentally ill being able to get firearms. But in February of last year, he actually blocked a regulation that would keep severely mentally ill patients from obtaining firearms. So he has got to be able to put his money where his mouth is. If he can prove that what he is saying is actually true, that he's not going to buckle under the oncoming pressure and what we know is going to be a huge push both behind closed doors and then publicly if needed by the NRA, because they are against any of this.
Let's talk about
then we'll see.
That pressure from the NRA, because Jack, that was one of the elements the president talked about, bipartisanship, but also the NRA. And we're hearing at least an inconsistent, if not conflicting message from the NRA about mental health. I first want you to listen to, this is Dana Lash at the CNN town hall talking about mental illness and people not being able to get a gun, and then the executive vice president of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre. Watch.
None of us support people who are crazy, who are a danger to themselves, who are a danger to others, getting their hands on a firearm.
Conversations with your doctor, your prescription information. Do we really want all that on a government list and in a government database?
So he's saying that access to medical records is a slippery slope, but Dana Lash is saying you want to keep people with mental illness from getting a weapon. How do you know that people have a mental illness without accessing their medical records, Jack?
You know, Victor, that's why this hasn't been done successfully before. It is very difficult in terms of privacy. Marie mentioned this Social Security check. By the way, that was opposed by the American Civil Liberties Union. They were on the same page as President Trump because of the question about due process. So I do think that you want to make sure that anybody gets due process, because that's what we do in America. We don't falsely accuse somebody of something.
So is the president wrong here? Is the president just assuming that he can bring his party along on mental health checks?
You know what I think would be really great is if we could hear from party leaders on both sides of the aisle right now and say, you know what, this is substantive. Let's get to work on it. Congressman Tim Murphy, who's no longer in the House, actually initiated this about 3 years ago. And I want to say this. The other thing is the legislation's already passed the House that would be the vehicle for this. It was passed in December by the Republican Congress, and I think Democrats were on board. Had in there the background check. How do you improve background checks? And so the vehicle is already right now pending in front of the U.S. Senate, and the idea of getting both parties on board, it's there. We can make that happen.
So one question to Jack is, will the president buckle when the NRA exerts overwhelming pressure on him because they gave him $30 million during his presidential campaign?
While we're going to swing at the NRA, let's remember it's about the Second Amendment. It's not about a political group, but I would also put in there.
Oh, it's absolutely about a political group.
Let him answer.
Maria, let me just say this. I would put in there, what is the effect of violence on video games, violence in Hollywood? And let's
Jack,
put
that
this
wasn't the
on
question.
The
question is, listen, the president said, Jack, let me finish this. Jack, the president said in the health care conversation that I will take the heat. Whatever this group puts together, I will take the heat on that. When the heat came a day or two later, he was backing out and doing exactly what he said he wouldn't do by asking for individual elements. If right now the president says the NRA is for it, and the NRA has said that they're not for it, long before he even started his campaign, what's
Victor,
the evidence he'll take the heat
it's not about, I know the NRA is hated by the left, but this is not about...
It has nothing to do with the left or the right. It has to do with the president's commitment to what...
This, just as he said, I want to give amnesty for 1 million DACA recipients.
Who's the Republican Party leader?
Democrat.
If you're saying the party leader should grab it, isn't that the president?
No, I'm talking about in the legislative branch. He's the executive branch. He's already made his position. Well, let's have Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell step forward and say, we're going to take it and run with it, because the House has already done something. But I think Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan can do it. I don't know why that is such a hard concept
Jack,
here, guys.
Listen to this. This is President Trump
from 2
years ago.
Because the NRA won't let them. That's
why. You bristled when I brought up Hollywood just now.
Jack, Maria, hold on for a second. I want to hear from the president. This is 2016, the beginning of the campaign.
I will get rid of gun-free zones on schools. My first day, it gets signed, okay? My first day. There's no more gun-free zones.
So agree with what the president wants to do or not, Jack. It's been more than 400 days since his first day, and he hasn't done that. Well, why should people believe that he's going to do now what he's saying he's going to do?
Well, actually, let's take a step back, because there's been a lot of misinformation about guns on campuses. 172 school districts in Texas allow it now. The state of Georgia does. The soundbite you said, why hasn't he done it? What I'm saying that a lot of that has been done already where it should be done on the state level. And we got to keep in mind that school boards make these laws, not the federal government.
Okay, Maria, quickly, 15 seconds if you can.
While Jack twists and turns trying to figure out whether twisting and turning, trying to figure out whether the president will be able to stand up to the NRA. We will see if that is the possibility. Jack, I'm talking.
Please.
I am speaking, Jack. While he